James. Welcome to the Quality Talks podcast. I'm really happy to have you on the show, and we will have quite an interesting talk about validation, training, validation, about training and reality on
Yeah.
the field. So maybe you could tell us a bit about how you got into this arena, because it's not really orthodox the way where you came from.
No, and certainly when we talk about the the clear path to finally arrive in a validation function, that's one thing that's certainly not clear, which can be seen in validation training, as we're going to discuss a bit later. My path into validation was one of opportunity, but equally my background is it was in software programming, software implementation. And then I had the opportunity to support data integrity projects for pharma clients, using that software background to provide sort of extra value into those projects. That then led into sort of realigning my experience of software implementation into the CSV mold, which it's quite an interesting segue because when you're outside of a regulated industry, although I had worked in a regulated industry before, I'd worked in fintech. It's interesting to see how frameworks and structures are built with the technology experience in mind, not just the kind of stakeholder management and documentation management that goes along with it. So that was really interesting in terms of how I kind of transitioned, and that really opened my eyes, especially when, as we're going to talk about, validation training is often easily accessible, but when you've been exposed to it, you sometimes, and I'm not saying this is absolutely every case, but it seems to be a lot of the times people come away from that with a feeling with, well, that's just common sense. I knew that before I walked into it, which made me think when we decided to discuss this, um, well, there's a really obvious reason behind that. You know, validation is not meant to be difficult. The actual logistical aspect of going from start to finish to a project, they might be laborious, it might be voluminous in terms of activity, but in terms of general principles, it's not something that is difficult in terms of any sensible or experienced person who's either worked in system implementation or within the pharma environment couldn't easily understand. You have a set
Right.
of requirements and designs that support those requirements, and then you have
Right, right.
executable documents.
What is the gap there? What is missing from the basic training that people usually get when they're going to train into forums and so on from the hands-on job?
Yeah. So, firstly, the understanding of the maturity of the organization that you're working in. Validation has one name but many versions. You go from company to company, and they're all very slightly different variations on a theme. And you have to understand why that is the way it is. You might have very light validation framework because the business is very interested in meeting a commercial target. So they need to get systems through and validate as quickly as possible, which is
Right.
nobody's book that's good. We need to take time with these things. But if you are aware of that and prepared, then you can start focusing on the document set within the validation pack and say, well, that means if they need to achieve a certain target, then a lot of time and investment needs to be applied in very key areas to get the stakeholders on board as early as possible, to get quality assurance on board as early as possible. I mean, you think about the circumstances where quality assurance is seen as a blocker because they were only sort of informed about certain aspects of the project halfway through. Of course, they're going to slow things down. So there are little things like that where we need to make people really aware that, okay, a URS, an FRS, an IQ, PQ, those are just components in a toolbox. You can pull those out, but you need to be hyper aware of resistance within the business, um, communicating with quality assurance to get effective service delivery. Because again, quality assurance are there about making sure that the job is being done correctly, because that provides a high level of quality. When we walk into validation training courses, that's only touched on very, very lightly. And then you get somebody walking out of that and then being put in front of a project and told, right, okay, now deliver this project, which again is rare. This is kind of the misnomer, okay? That you walk into a CSV validation course and you walk out and you're a CSV lead. I mean, really, that's very unusual, I would suggest.
Right, right, because you still need to get the hands-on experience and to see how everything works and to see that you really can, work with all the departments and make sure that you can bring the whole idea together to build the puzzle here, right?
There's the triangle, it's key. The project manager, the CSV lead, and quality assurance.
Right.
Those three parties are on the same wavelength and communicate effectively, then you have a really, as smooth as can be project. I've delivered projects where the challenge hasn't been delivering the system. The challenge has been reining in the business because quality assurance have not been strong. So quality assurance have been told, right, okay, this project is extremely important. We need to get the system through as quickly as possible. Just, whatever comes along, just make sure it's reviewed and signed as quickly as possible. And I'm being kind there.
Right.
Yeah.
So usually the CSV experts are, in many companies, they come also from the quality assurance. That they may be an independent department from inside the quality assurance, but in many big companies, they are also a part of the quality assurance.
Well, they can be, but equally, there's a conflict of interest there. They shouldn't really be mixing with quality assurance. I've seen them included within the IT department as
Right.
well. Really, ideally, they should be their own department, probably reporting to the CIO.
Right. So then you have the CSV, the project management, and the quality assurance, and then you have an independent triangle, as you say, that really oversees it from different angles, and then you don't have the conflict of interest of either you are coming from the quality assurance, and then you. Put in breaks in the project because you say this and this doesn't work, or you are, for example, coming from the project management and then the quality assurance doesn't have enough push and then you just push it through without decent validation and then you have problems.
Really worrying because when somebody walks into a CSV validation course, my belief is what they should be told is that the marketing around the word validation is very, very poor because people hear the word validation, they hear slow, expensive, and challenging. What they should be hearing is one statement: getting what you paid for. That should be the statement. That's why we do validation. We do it for a lot of reasons in terms of patient safety and quality, yes, and those are the primary objectives. But if people just said, well, you just paid for a system and you're spending, X hundreds of thousands of pounds after it, do you not want to be sure that that system actually does what you want it to do in a compliant way? Surely, if it was presented in a slightly different way like that, although it wouldn't be necessarily, people singing and dancing, it would be a little bit more palatable for the business because it's linked to the investment of significant amounts of money.
Right.
So yeah, the as I say, the nuts and bolts of validation, documentation, how they flow in sequence, approval sequence, rules of thumb, they are important. I'm not saying that they are not important, but they can be learned independently outside of the organization that you work in. Yeah. But when you actually get into it, I would say, the understanding of those rules and following those rules, that's the easy part. The really difficult part is actually being prepared for stakeholder management. Speaking to quality assurance, tell them our SOP on validation doesn't support this type of activity. The business wants us to do something in a certain way. and working with them and saying, well, how do we deal with this in a collaborative way, but still helping them maintain their independence, is far more useful than spending, I don't know, 4 hours or a full day course on how validation works. Because when you go back to your organization, you're going to be told how validation works. Why? Because you have an SOP there that tells you how it works. In various different levels of quality. I agree. Sometimes they can be exhaustive, sometimes they can be very thin. But you'll have your templates, you'll have your overarching procedure, you'll have your deviation procedure, you'll have your testing group, all those sorts of things will already be in place. But preparing for somebody to work in a validation environment is so much more about stakeholder management than it is about anything else.
Right. And how do you change then this mindset?
So when you talked about it before, where do people come from when they start working in
Right.
CSV? And the advantage of having people from different backgrounds working in there is it creates a well-rounded team. So if you think about somebody who's brought in from scientific or laboratory background, and then somebody's moved across from quality assurance, and then somebody has a software background, they can work really well in a team because they have shared experiences.
Right.
You know,
Right.
in terms of shared experiences,
But
but through
also
different.
exactly shared experiences because they know the system, the GMP, but they also bring experiences from other areas like manufacturing. Different devices. You know how it works. You know the failures. The problems that
Yeah,
may occur. Right.
but in terms of actually having a smooth CSV project, when somebody selects a system, you're the CSV lead. Now, if you're lucky, you'll have been brought into that discussion by the project manager and the business team early at the time when people are selecting it. Often that doesn't happen, but let's just speculate that did happen. Wouldn't it be just as easier to bring in quality assurance at the same time when the
Right.
system selection is actually happening?
Exactly.
You know, and sometimes that's kind of marginalized because people say, well, we do a risk assessment, and they read our risk assessment. Well, okay, yeah, that's a nice entry point, and that's a good milestone. But if you went even further back earlier in the process and discussed about the business processes that you want to digitize and how those systems could be perceived to meet those objectives, quality assurance can become a really big ally. And I don't mean in terms of compromising their independence. They have such valuable input. They can talk about things like, well, okay, you're using a SaaS platform. Uh, have you considered the release cycle and the impact on continuous validation and the interruption that might cause? Have you considered external integrations and how those might be maintained? So those questions can be posed, maybe not answered, but posed earlier on in the process. So I think when we walk out of a validation course, yes, in your back pocket, you understand how the documentation lines up, you understand how risk is managed as well. But you should really focus on that communication triangle between the project manager, quality assurance, and yourself.
And is it something that you can learn in such courses that people can teach you, or is it something that really needed to happen inside the organization, really hands on? Or can you theoretically also educate about it that during the trainings and give like examples and simulations?
Ideally, if you have a strong QMS, it should be built into it. So the points of milestones, it's system selection. There might be a tender that goes out, or there might be sort of a request that goes out. There should be there should be entry points for those other departments to be involved at that stage as part of the procedure. So you can do it procedurally. Um, in terms of training, I've not really seen that type of training before, other than general business management training. Which would be really helpful, because if you could emphasize and present those different perspectives, then people will appreciate why they come up against obstacles. I'll give you an example. So, if you're sitting and you perceive that quality assurance are a blocker, each time you send a document to them and it's taking them a long time to review it, or maybe they're sending it back with multiple comments coming back, that can be perceived as really, really negative. And you obviously ask yourself questions as to why that's happening. But if you don't communicate with quality assurance before you even send the document to them, if they're not involved in the drafting, I don't mean writing it, but giving an orientation as it moves through those cycles, what would you expect? Someone's going to read a document cold, which happens often. They read documents cold. And they're going to say, well, I don't understand the context of these statements. And I don't understand why you haven't linked out to a certain document.
Right, right. So I think it's really an important point also from the quality assurance department, because somebody who comes from quality, I know how much issue the quality has with such miscommunication, because usually quality are the ones that write the documents without discussing with other departments, and then you have the same problem.
Yeah,
And I think it works both ways. So it's if you need to collaborate on a system, or you're writing procedures which someone else needs to work with, so you should always do it in a collaboration way, because that's why the system works like that, and it would be much more helpful for everybody to work on the project together, and to make sure that, as you said, the people come from different backgrounds and each one has his own perspective, right? So we have the regulations, and then we have the project.
yeah, but it's also procedure. I mean, procedure takes precedence in all of that. But you think about, what's quality assurance's job? They're there to protect the patient, protect the data, and protect the organization. They're in a policy that makes sure that people are following a strong QMS, that it meets compliance and regulatory standards, and that people are following those. Yeah. So it's not, if you take that on board, it's understandable that they're going to push stuff back. But if you involve them early enough in the process, then they've got a more rounded understanding of what it is that you're doing. So they're not sending things back through lack of information and reading things cold. They might be sending things back for, oh, you told me about a certain aspect 3 weeks ago. Have you also considered this as well? And they add value at that point. So they become an ally. Equally with project managers when they're seeking timelines, and that's a difficult balance as well, communicating and working with managers.
Exactly. And it's interesting for me because you said you came from fintech, right? So it's a really highly regulated environment. So how do you compare it to pharma? Would you say they're the same level of regulation, or one of them has higher and more stringent regulations?
This might come as a surprise, but well, maybe not actually. I think the protection of money over the protection of patients, it's quite a different level of well, governance is the wrong word. Let me put it this way, because obviously in past years, the financial sector has certainly not been a healthy one, and they've made very, very bad decisions and been allowed to.
Right.
I don't, yeah. When you look at systems and how they're actually put in and implemented and managed, there is little to no tolerance of error. When we look in pharma, historically, people have tended to look backwards rather than forwards. There's a resistance to change, and
Right.
that for good reason. So there's a lot of investment involved in changing the digital landscape of a company. It's a lot of time, a lot of resources. But
Right.
you can give an example, lots of examples. People certainly, recognize that password sharing's happened in the past in pharma. Manufacturing facilities, equipment might be partially damaged or being dropped and is continued to be used. So when we think about those two industries, it's probably not a fair comparison. They're in different levels of maturity in terms of acceptance of technology. One of it is pulled by technology significantly, which is pharma, because the regulators want us to leverage technology more so. The fintech are are pushing it. Sorry, they want a better system. They want a more efficient system. They want to build a faster system. So they're really driving it. But it's a bit of an unfair comparison, because Um, the human element in fintech is very much marginalized, whereas in pharma, quite rightly, they want to take those steps in a more considered way.
Right. So it was very interesting because I've spoken to Alex Hall in a podcast about risk management, and we talked about that in finance. Sometimes the risk management is much better, and that they have really well developed systems in place to manage the risks because it involves money. And as you said, sometimes money is king, and when you are talking about money, those industries try to defend their investment much harder, even than in pharma when we are talking about human life here.
No, it gives them more awareness on the decision making that they're taking. So getting back to validation, if you think about now, there's a large voice talking about moving towards computer system assurance rather than computer system validation.
Right.
And what that relies upon is you select a system created by a vendor, and you say, well, the vendor has done a lot of testing. They've done a lot of testing. It might be a system that's in common use across the industry. What we're going to do is we're going to focus our testing solely on the changes that we make. And we're going to rely upon the vendor testing for everything that they did. Now, that is quite a big leap of faith in some ways, but equally, it can only be carried out successfully if there's robust vendor management. So if you go in and you say, right, okay, yes, we're going to audit that vendor first. We're going to see what their documentation is like, and then we can make a decision as to whether we move ahead with computer system assurance. Now, if we go back a few steps and we think about training now, validation, training is very much an orthodox set of rules. It hasn't moved for so many years. Now we're getting a sea change, moving towards computer system assurance. And again, when we think about, well, how do we train somebody there? We need to train them in a sense of awareness of, well, when you mention it, what's the risk around moving towards that level of
Right, right. So
control?
it won't be like so strongly process oriented, it will be mindset oriented to think and risk management oriented.
Yeah, you're going to be leveraging this. You're still going to take on a system. You're still going to configure it, and then you're going to test those configurations. You're just not going to potentially look at the underlying standard functionality as closely as you would, other than perhaps a document review. Which, I mean, from past experience, it can be quite scary that unless you understand. Well, okay, we know that we've done an audit. We've looked at the vendor's validation pack. We've seen how they go about doing their work. We've seen how they manage testing and then the results of those activities as well. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of having training around those types of methods, it still comes back to that thing. Well, okay, I'm talking about CSA. What do quality assurance feel about CSA now? They're going to be very, very cautious because if we run a project like that, they're going to say, well, we want you to test more. We want you to. We're not satisfied that you're testing the system to its fullest capability. Well, that's again about stakeholder management. No, we think we can do this because we've had successful audit results. We've looked at the validation and see that they've done it professionally. And we're going to focus on the areas that matter to us in terms of our own configuration. So again, it's about stakeholder management. Equally with project managers. So project managers come to a CSV lead and they'll say, how long is it going to take us to produce a document? Or how long is it going to take us to test? And we're sitting there and thinking, well, we're not involved in time management here. We're involved in deliverables management, which, yes, okay, you can estimate those times. But that stakeholder conversations, that's where the skills need to be built in validation training. Yeah, like I said, you can go into multiple different companies and validation procedures exist, and there's variations on the theme. Even now, we're moving into possibilities of using agile as well. So all these stands are shifting, but what is really key in terms of training anybody in validation is that stakeholder management. You'll not get anywhere unless you can bring the end users on board, or the business, the project manager, so you can reassure them that things are flowing as they should, and quality assurance, so they have a lower level of anxiety because they can see that risk is being managed.
Right.
That is actually what you're delivering in validation.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
you can substantiate that, but that's the key skill.
Right. So do you think that more of the stakeholders should also go to such training? So, for example, usually who goes to this CSV training? The one that needs to work in the system validation, that wants to become a CSV lead and so on, but not somebody else who supports it from QA, not the management and so on.
It should work a different way. The CSV department, if such a thing exists, they should see themselves as internal service suppliers to the rest of the business, and they should present their service delivery to the other stakeholders and say, right, okay, this is how we validate. These are the components. This is how we're going to look at this aspect of the system. This is how we're going to evaluate risk. This is how we're going to. They should present that in sort of in lay person's terms, certainly to the business. I mean, quality assurance will be well aware of how validation is working, but equally they should be honest and open about how communication needs to work. So they should say, well, okay, if business, if you're not articulating exactly what it is that you want as close as you possibly can, then it's going to be more difficult for us to actually produce a system that you want. And if you disappear for sort of weeks on end and come back looking for an update, well, don't be surprised if you're not getting what you expect. Equally with quality assurance, we're gonna involve you in a lot of meetings now. Oh, well, hang on a second, quality assurance sit in the shadows, don't they? No, we want to bring you in so you're aware of the decisions that are being made, so we can make decisions with you, so that we're not wasting time. So the project manager's now happy. Okay, we're starting to stimulate good communication here. So in terms of preparing a project team before the project starts, really, there's lots of things that the project manager can do, but it's also beholden on CSV or IS compliance or whatever you want to call them, the validation people, to really say to these other stakeholders, before we start, this is how we see moving through the phases of validation. These are the documents that we're going to use. These are the responsibilities. This is where I need information from. I need it from you guys over the business. And you might need to bring other people in from your departments as well to expose them to some meetings. That's where external training can't do that.
So it should be organization oriented. So everything that you say seems really logical and common sense, actually. But you said that you're from your experience, it doesn't really work like that in most of the companies.
No, it doesn't, because, and it is that business politics. There is, it's very unusual, certainly with people I've worked with and the organizations that I've worked within, to find validation leads who are permanent staff. And there might be a number of different reasons outside of my perspective, but my perspective is that you need a validation lead who's worked in different companies. Why? Because they've experienced lots of different situations and they're not seen as a permanent fixture. They're seen as potentially somebody who can bring solutions to long-standing problems. So if I've been in companies where the validation process is very, very light, which means there's a lot of communication with quality assurance required to make sure that you're keeping the activities compliant. You have to do that. You can't do it. I've been in other organizations where the validation procedure is really, really structured and very, very firm, and there's no room for movement. And in that instance, you have to work a lot more with the project manager,
Right.
because delay is hypercritical. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of having a CSV individual, and obviously people's abilities do vary and based on experience and just general skill set, I would say it's probably more desirable for an organization to seek a validation lead externally rather than internally.
Mhm.
Project manager internally, absolutely no problem. Although again, more and more these days, project managers are also brought in externally. Quality assurance, absolutely internal. Although I've done quality assurance as an external partner as well. But yeah, the like I said, the sort of the validation training. You've got things like the GAMP guide, of course. That gives you really good standard approaches in terms of how you should go about doing things. But until you walk into an organization and then the light bulb flashes on and you realize for the first time, well, that's the easy bit. The difficult bit is actually stakeholder management. Um, yeah, until you realize that, it's difficult really then to go on a training course to put anything that anybody's saying to you in context.
Right. So just to summarize it, right? So the key is communication, 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 and as you said, they try to bring CSV leads, maybe from external sources, at least as support, because they have seen much more systems and they can bring a lot of experience, especially for big projects, right, to help steer it.
Projects, you probably have maybe a split there because you still need people who are aware of the organization, but more so potentially, system SMEs. So if they've validated the same system in other organizations, that's also helpful. But what you said, yeah, it's communication, 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 but not in this general understanding of what communication is. It needs to be a pull. So the CSV lead has to pull QA into the process at critical moments. They need to pull the project manager into meetings so they're aware of what the next stage gate is going to be and what the challenges are as well. So it's you almost become like a pseudo project manager. You shouldn't assume the responsibilities of the project manager because you're not a facilitator in terms of getting things done easier. But you should certainly see yourself as this pivot point
between QA and the project lead.
Yeah, because too often I've seen CSV leads where they see themselves as part of the business, and they're not really. They're this little service that feeds into the business that's going to provide the business the system that they want. But to do that, they've also got to apply pressure to the business to make sure they get information from them. But they're not really business partners in that sense. And equally, they can't just say, well, we'll push anything through. Don't worry about quality. They need to work with quality and say, right, okay, we have these challenges. What's the best way forward? And absorb them. So it's a really difficult job to do because you're really in the middle. You can't let the business just do what it wants. But equally, you've got to sometimes say to quality, well, hang on a second, you're telling me that this isn't possible, but our procedures allow us to do this, or if we can deviate, risk assess it, and record our activities, is that not possible? These sorts of points of question need to happen because, again, as I say, the QMS varies from business to business. And sometimes you have to be the problem solver.
Right. In the end, you can always find a way, a documented way to do something different from the procedures or update the procedure to your needs. So you cannot, look at them as a holy grail that you cannot touch and move because they're there, because they're not there to interfere with your work. They're there to help you. And you see if it interferes with the work, which is doesn't impact their regulation, doesn't impact the quality and the risk, then you should consider doing some revisions, of course.
You would have an organization that understands that quality is key in everything they do and it should never be sacrificed for anything. A QMS that represents that people basically just follow step by step without having to worry about intricacies of other political sort of internal politics. But what often you get is you get a mixture of things. You'll get, as I say, an organization that has really optimistic commercial targets. So they push things forward and push these things forward. Then you have QA resisting that force until the point where they might even be undermined by the business. And then you're in that environment. How does the training prepare you for that? I don't know. I mean, that's very difficult to kind of train people for that scenario. Or you have, a quality department, hopefully, that is very much in the driving seat that says, right, nothing is past us unless it's in a really, it is the standard that we require.
Right,
That I
right,
love. Fantastic. Because what that says to me is that if they're able to do that, that means that normally the procedures should be really clear. So there should be no need to kind of question why the feedback from QA is as it is, which means that the business realizes that it takes time to validate a system, which then means that the project manager understands that, okay, there is a time that we will release a system, but it's only dependent on that system being released with evidence showing that it was done correctly in a quality way, which means actually finally that the end users and the service are going to receive that system. They might not be patient, but they understand that there is a process that has to be, has to, people have to go through in a measured way. But as I say, the amount of times that actually really happens, that you have that scenario, is zero, because there'll be one variable there that applies pressure.
right,
There'll be one
right, right,
minimum.
right.
That's where the CSV training is very difficult. For me, if you had a CSV training course, yeah, maybe a quarter of it will be the process itself, but the rest of it should really be around an awareness of why certain things happen during validation. So you might have people combining documents. I want an IQ/OQ. Why do we want that? Because we only want one set of signatures. We want the document to go through quicker.
Right, right. So play simulations and about
Yeah,
the process.
absolutely.
What what goes wrong with different projects. So basically, not don't sit there and teach about the V model. Everybody can read about it, right? So do,
It has its place, but you know that
but it
stuff.
shouldn't be the main part, right? So
Yeah.
you should do the simulation and play out different possibilities and talk about cooperation between departments and what is the role of each department, how to work together to achieve it, basically.
So in terms of being able to take the initiative and find solutions to demanding problems, there are golden rules. A CSV person should always consult with QA before taking an action outside of procedure. So it can be risk assessed and recorded correctly. That should be your first golden rule. But that's reactive, in some ways. Being proactive, if you've got end users who can't articulate what they want from the system, how do you prepare for that? When okay, you've got people who've been working with paper for 25 years. Now they're going to be put in a system. How are they going to articulate what they want from the system? Well, we can prepare workshops for that. We can demonstrate the system. In its standard form. We can discuss, have two-way conversation about the concerns that they might have about how the system would work. So these little things. So you're right. Scenario building within those training courses or workshops are far more value add, because, as I say, at the end of the day, that person's going to go back in their organization, and there's already a validation procedure telling them what to do. There are already templates, and if they're written reasonably well, they should be understandable and executable. So yeah, that's why it's expensive validation training. Easily £1,000 a day. Multiple providers provide validation training for maybe if you're looking at a 3-day course of £1,000 or $1,000. But when you walk away from it, you say to yourself, yeah, well, I understand how the
What did I learn
document.
there, right? So what did I pay? So I read the document, right? So exactly. Yeah, so those are really great points, James. So thank you very much for all this information that you have provided about your insight, because I think it's really valuable, especially because you come from a different field. So you come from software, you come from fintech, and you have so much that you can bring to the industry, that you are bringing to the industry with different points of view. And I hope that people will listen to it and they think about what you said and really do something about it at their organization.
Two things I would sort of say as my final kind of things, it would be that people should see validation, yes, as being really, really important, but as a perception, you should think of it as basically assuring that you're getting what you paid for. that you really get what it is that you want. So it's not an obstacle. It's a gateway that gives you reassurance and confidence that your future is going to be bright as a consequence of going through those steps. The second thing I would say is that validation is so much more around bringing people together and sharing information than it is just a process of signing off documents one after another. That's really key, and especially above anybody else, bringing quality assurance in as early as possible in the process. That will save you so much pain. Might not at the beginning, you might be wondering whether it was the right decision, but as you start going through the process and delivering more and more deliverables, it will become easier because you'll have a common understanding of where things have come and where they're going to.
Great, perfect. James Ainsworth, thank you very much.
Thank you, Yan. I really appreciate it.